Council member of NECA. You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. Now, in case the number is still the same: 0813-331-3172. 0813-331-3172. So if you have any question about the national minimum wage, maybe there's something that you want to know or something you are curious about, now is the time to ask that question. Okay, let's start, Mr. Nwankwo. Let me start by asking you why we need a national minimum wage and what a national minimum wage is all about.
Good morning, listeners. Thank you for having me on your program today.
Pleasure.
Before I start, I would like to make two general remarks, just so that we have the context that will guide us for the rest of the conversation this morning. The first one is that the idea of a minimum wage is one of the ways of promoting decent work. Decent work and social justice. It is a very good thing that Nigeria has adopted the minimum wage concept. Actually, it is such a popular concept, and over 90% of member states of the International Labour Organization set minimum wage in their countries.
Okay.
So that is how popular this concept is. The second remark that I would like to make is that out of respect for the work modalities of the tripartite committee on national minimum wage that has been set by Mr. President, I would like to restrain myself in talking more specifically and directly on the work of that committee, since it's still an active committee and it's still on and working.
But you can give us a brief view of why they were set up, and what what is it about and what they're supposed to be doing?
Certainly. I would like as much as possible to provide insight on issues around minimum wage generally, without speaking directly to the work of the committee.
No. We can't ask you that because, as you said, it's still ongoing.
Yes.
So even if you make a statement now, what if they change it tomorrow? They've not concluded. So, but sometimes you hear the news, we hear the news, and then we hear there's a committee being set up, and we are wondering what exactly are they supposed to do? Just what are they supposed to do, not what are they doing now?
Yes, I was coming to that actually. So, by way of reference from Mr. President, as read out by the Vice President during the inaugural session of the committee, simply put, the expectation is for the committee to recommend a national minimum wage to Mr. President.
Okay.
Simply put.
Okay.
However, I'm aware that, if I must say immediately, that there has been some strong opinions and suggestions in some quarters that we are dealing with a living wage. But I like to immediately say that it's a national minimum wage that is expected from the committee. A living wage and the national minimum wage are two different concepts. And if the time in your program allows later, I can explain the difference, but for now, let's just take it that there is a difference between a minimum wage and a living wage.
Okay. So we are talking about minimum wage and living wage. Let's just say it now. What's the difference between the two?
Good. First, a minimum wage is the lowest possible amount that an employer is expected to pay to an employed person. This means that even if an employed person, out of desperation or pressure, goes into a contract of employment with an amount that is below the minimum wage will subsist. The employer will be required to pay that once it is found out.
Okay.
A minimum wage is normally set by legislation or regulation, but it can also be a product of collective bargaining. But it's a wage floor, the threshold amount that an employer cannot pay below.
Okay.
It can be adjusted or reviewed from time to time. But when you move away from a minimum wage and begin to talk about a living wage, then the strong implication is that you're going to refer always to the cost of living in the country.
Okay.
And when you get into a discussion on the cost of living, several other issues come into play, which means that you first have to talk of what is the need of the average worker and their families. And also you have to consider what is the basket that you have to measure to be able to establish the cost of living, which means that that basket is where you track the changes in price levels so that you can always have reliable and accurate basis for establishing what the cost of living is, so that you can reference the wage that is paid to make sure that the standard of living of the worker does not drop. Now, this is the simple part.
Okay.
The more difficult part is that you need to have all the stakeholders accept the source, the analysis, the reporting, reliability and accuracy of this data for that to inform negotiation or conversations around wage issues. And this is where the difficulty lies. Till today, yes, you can define the living wage, but there is no consensus, even at the international level of International Labour Organization level, as to the acceptable definition of what the living wage should be.
Because there are so many things that go into it.
There are many cultural and social factors. Number one, if I want to establish the size of the average family, that we have to track what their needs are.
Okay.
What is the size of the average family? There are subjective cultural, social interpretation. Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? 6? That is one conversation. The other conversation is what kind of basket are we going to constitute, which we have to track over time to be able to see if changes in price level requires a change in the minimum wage. And economists tell us that the moment your wage or salary changes, that basket changes. But you need to establish a base from which you track the changes over time. So the issue is, what is the basket I'm dealing with from today? 5 years later, 2 years later, how far has it changed? So the summary here is that when you want to deal with the living wage, you have to have very rigorous and transparent sourcing, analysis and reporting of the data that is acceptable for all the stakeholders that are involved in the process, and this is where the real issue lies with the living wage.
Okay. You said that these wages can be reviewed. How often or should they be reviewed? Because ever since this committee has been set up, Nigerians have been waiting, and then of course, as you said, we have been hearing different suggestions from different parts on the wage, the minimum wage, and so Nigerians have been saying that what exactly is the new minimum wage? When is it? How often should it be reviewed and refixed, for instance? So, how often should the minimum wage be reviewed?
Actually, in the extant law, the current minimum wage law that we have in the country, I think in 2019, for the first time, it was set as a matter of law that max 5 years, the minimum wage should be reviewed.
Is it always an upward review?
Well, that's an interesting question. Normally what happens in reality is that it's adjusted upwards because there are changes in the economy that suggest that it should review the minimum wage upwards. But theoretically it doesn't have to be so. If the economy has improved so much that the minimum wage should go down, it should go down as well. And this is because the minimum wage is just one more instrument for either stimulating the economy or for addressing social and labor issues in a particular country.
Oh, okay. All right. So you said between 5 years. When was the last time the minimum wage? Do you remember the last time the minimum wage was reviewed in Nigeria?
Presidential committee was set up in 2018. So they carried on with their work, which culminated in the new minimum wage that was signed into law in the first half of, I think the first quarter or the first half, about April of 2019. So that's the last time the minimum wage was reviewed.
So technically we are like due for another review.
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about, as we said, we've heard of different suggestions. We've been talking about, some people said a 1 million naira. How feasible is this?
Let me start by saying in answer to this question, that nearly everyone agrees that the current minimum wage of 30,000 naira, which comes to $20 or less, when you convert that into dollars, is unrealistic and needs to be reviewed. However, it's very important that expectations are managed, because in setting a minimum wage, the best practice, and this is provided by instruments from ILO, in the laws of the country, the practices of different entities and stakeholders, you want to take into consideration the needs of workers and their families, but also other economic factors. That second leg is usually suppressed in some workers. So the needs of workers and their families are no doubt important, but the economic factors, and what are the economic factors? What are the economic objectives of government in terms of growing the economy or stabilizing the economy? What are the unemployment issues? How would it impact unemployment or employment? And then also enterprise sustainability, and that's where we come in from the private sector as well, because affordability is very important when you are talking of wages. It's got to be paid by someone or by an organization. So on issues of affordability, you look at enterprise sustainability, and really organizations and businesses are dealing with all kinds of issues. So coming back directly to the question, there is probably clear consensus that a review is necessary, but all stakeholders, the tripartite constituents in the committee, need to work in a more realistic way in managing expectations, such that at the end of the day, whatever is arrived at will be acceptable and easy to comply with for all the parties involved. Yes.
All right, number once again is 0813 331 3172. 0813 331 3172. We're talking about the national minimum wage, and we have in the studio as our guest Mr. Chuma Nwankwo, and he's been explaining a few things that has to go into the minimum wage, setting it and everything. So if you have questions or comments, please call in and let's hear what you have to say. Hello, good morning.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Naomi, and good morning to Mr. Nwankwo in the studio.
Good morning, and thank you.
On the strength of your last question, Naomi, I would like Mr. Nwankwo to please tell the Nigerian workers a realistic minimum wage that he thinks the government should look at in consideration for them, and probably taking into consideration the fact that even the 30,000 current minimum wage is not being paid by some state governments. What can be done to ensure a realistic implementation of a new national minimum wage?
Can I have your name before you go?
My name is Benga Ogedengbe.
Okay, thank you so much, Benga.
Probably, thank you very much. Into consideration the fact that even the 30,000.
Thank you, Benga, for your question. I think in arriving at a realistic minimum wage, the needs of workers and their families have got to be taken into consideration. There is no doubt about that. But also, on the other hand, because we're dealing with a minimum wage and not a living wage, other factors are important to consider, and I think I had already highlighted them under the scope of economic factors that should be considered. The public hearing is a very important part of the process and work of the committee, because there are many experts, and there's very good capacity in the country from civil society and institutions to make contributions to this process, and those contributions I think must have been received by the committee in the last 1 or 2 weeks when these were were set up in the different geopolitical zones. So one expects that they will take all this into consideration, take the capacity of the paying constituents in the setup. I mean, businesses, government as employer as well, their ability to pay that. I think somewhere there will be a meeting point in between the two, but being realistic is very important to the process. What happens when you set the minimum wage very high in such a way that businesses or employers will not be able to pay? What happens is that you get the opposite effect of what you are trying to achieve, because then compliance becomes difficult, and then you begin to promote indecent work, because people who are desperate to get a job will sign off anything, and then compliance becomes a problem, and then they are paid pittance that they cannot report openly because they are afraid of losing their jobs. So you need to be careful in balancing these two needs, that you come up with a minimum wage that is simple to implement, that there's capacity to pay, and then at the same time you promote a decent work and make it easier for the paying partners to comply.
So one of the things that Mr. Gbenga said now is that, so considering that some people are not even paying the current 30,000 naira minimum wage, what is being done or what should be done to ensure that at least let's get you started to that level before we even consider the next level? What guarantee do we have that if the wage is changed now, this same set of people will comply?
Good. I think there are two government agencies or institutions that have been tasked with monitoring and enforcement of the minimum wage. That is the Ministry of Labor and the National Salaries, Incomes and Wages Commission. I know these two agencies collaborate, and with the right funding also, it's easy for them to fan out to the states and all geopolitical zones where the businesses are, especially after a random sampling. They might decide that these are the areas where we have vulnerable workers who might not be earning the minimum wage, so they can zero in on that. Or there are other provisions in the law on how enforcement can be realized. Workers themselves who are earning less than the minimum wage can report. Even workers' representatives are also empowered by the law at some point to take up issues on the minimum wage where that is not being complied with. So these two institutions of government have the requirement to monitor compliance with the national minimum wage. So I think that's where I would like to leave it. The other thing to say is that in the organized private sector especially, I am not aware actually of any business in the organized private sector that is not complying with the minimum wage. I think most that I have seen data for are far away from even the 30,000. I mean, they are paying much more than the 30,000. The sector where there might be issues, but I don't have empirical data to be very certain on this, but I suspect strongly, just like every good informed observer might conclude as well, is the informal sector. You have a lot of vulnerable workers. The informal sector is not documented, so there is a chance, and probably the binoculars should be aimed more in that direction as well. Okay,
so I'm still talking about the enforcement, and you were. I was going to go there to the to this particular sector of people who may not be getting the minimum wage. Should, for instance, the small scale businesses, small medium scale businesses, they are not big businesses, and they will. Does this minimum wage also apply to them?
Currently, there are exceptions to the minimum wage. If an entity or an organization is employing less than 25 workers, they are exempted from the minimum wage.
Oh, okay.
But having said that, assuming you are not exempted, I think some of them also, it's a survival game for some of them, given the difficulties, the economic and harsh realities in the country. But I think that some of them are making decent efforts and are actually complying with the minimum wage as well. Probably a lot of them in in that sector are also complying with the minimum wage. It's the informal sector that is more of my concern.
The informal sector, yeah, those are actually the ones I was referring to. Yeah. The informal sector, the lady that has started a business on her own and is employing 1 or 2 people to float that business. I'm assuming from what you said, she will be exempted from the minimum wage.
Yes, with less than 25 workers, she would be.
Okay, so another thing that's another problem, because of this hype in minimum wage, everybody's listening to it on radio, everybody's watching, seeing how it goes. Will increasing minimum wage not ultimately increase the prices of products and goods outside? What effect do you think an increase or an adjustment to the minimum wage will have on prices of stuff?
On that, it's a real concern. However, I think it will not be an argument for not reviewing the minimum wage. If not, we create more problems and challenges for the worker. But for that kind of concern, what I see is a call for improving the general living conditions, so that whatever you give as minimum wage will help ensure that we get the maximum value for every naira. The real issue with inflation in the country, in my view, is yes, these are components that you can factor in the impact on inflation, but the real drivers have been one.
Let me take a call before you go ahead.
Yes, please.
Hello, good morning. Hello? Hello? Okay, we can't hear you, so you may have to call us back. We can't hear anything. Maybe you are hearing. So you may have to call us back. Please do. If you want to call in, number is 0813-331-3172. Please go ahead.
Yes, continuing from where I stopped. So the real drivers of inflation have been one, the main drivers, not the only drivers. The currency depreciation, because we import almost everything. So they pass through into general price levels in the country. I think that is number one.
Okay, hello?
Factor.
Wow, hello? No idea what's happening. This is the second dropped call we're having. Please try and call us back. We can't hear anything. Or you can send a message if that call is, or you can send a message into the same number 0813-331-3172.
Yes, and then continuing. The other driver, even though this is sometimes less emphasized, but the other driver is government borrowing, the ways and means, deficit spending, and all of that pushes money into the economy. But the central bank, especially the central bank we have today, is working hard on stabilizing the economy again and on all those. After this, we can then talk about all the other factors of insecurity, which is driving food inflation and so on and so forth. So I'm not so worried as such in that respect. I am more worried about the effect in setting up expectations, such as if we begin to talk about unrealistic amounts and we set up that expectations in the mind of workers, then the market operators, the market woman and all that are
already thinking
you're going to get
money
so
somewhere.
much money, so I need to get my cut out of that, and then that can drive prices up. I think that we need to also begin to manage that in the expectations and how we send the messages into
Okay, so you mentioned quite a few things that cause inflation for now, and given the current economic realities we have now in Nigeria, and then the factor when we talk about the ease of doing business is not as smooth as businesses would like. A lot of people have been saying that they don't really have high hopes for the... Hello,
good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, this is Dapo from April.
Dapo, thank you for calling.
Good morning. I want to greet our guest this morning for his analysis. But in my own view, I see all these things as a jamboree. The reason why I said so is that when you look at what labor is also putting on the table It's not realistic. Secondly, if you look at the representative from the government side, a lot of them are, even the 30,000, most of those governors there in their state, if they can't afford it, they are not paying the 30,000 naira. Not to not talk of, we're talking about 1 million, talking about 700,000 and all that. You see, this is my fear, especially for the private sector. Is there going to be a measure where at the end of the day, when they arrive at a particular amount to be paid, that the private sector, the people at the private sector will not lose their job? For me, because we're only looking at it from one side, yes, the government workers. What about the private sectors? Are we not considering them? Is there any policy? Is there any sanction for any organization that will, because the minimum wage has now been increased to 700,000? So because of that, I have to downsize. Is there any policy? Is there any restriction to that? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dayo from Peru.
Yes, Dayo, I think there are many things packed into your question. There is one aspect on whether a consultation is needed or not, and then there is the other part on sanctions, and then there is the other part on being realistic with whatever figure that the process has to come up with. So maybe I try to touch on these 3 points quickly. The first one is on a consultation. No, it's not a jamboree. You always need a committee. Actually, if we have time, I would give you a little history about how the country has always dealt with wage issues. And maybe I should quickly do that because it's an important historical context in answering your question. The government has always worked with committees because consultation is the best process for dealing with wage issues. Whatever you come up with will be more acceptable, and then it's easy to comply with when you consult. And to have a meaningful and structured consultation, you will always work with what we call the tripartite constituents. In this case, the government, both as employer and as regulator, and then you have the private sector involved, led by NECA in the process, and then you also have labor, and the two labor affiliations or central organizations are involved, TUC and NLC. So this is the best way to do that, and this is sitting on technical instruments that have been developed by the International Labour Organization, and specifically Convention number 28 of 1926 and Convention 131 of 1970 or 1971, if I'm not mistaken. These two are on minimum wage fixing, so it already recommends to governments of member countries how they should set the minimum wage. The first one I mentioned, Convention 28 of 1926, at that time addressed the issue of setting a minimum wage by regulation or legislation for those who do not arrive at it through collective bargaining. So those who do not have collective bargaining machineries in their sector. So they encourage governments to legislate or set by regulation. Then Convention 131 even raised the game further. It delivered like 3 or 4 important things to the process. The first one is that first, minimum wage should be arrived at through consultation, and the consultation should involve these tripartite partners through social dialogue, as I've mentioned. And then it goes ahead to also say that minimum wage process, setting it, you will need to take into consideration the needs of workers and their families and other economic factors. So that's where I had actually drawn some of the expressions that I used earlier in this conversation. So that is on the part of consultation. I think it's the right way to go. Now, even our own government, in my view, when it comes to wage issues in the past, had also done a good job in terms of setting commissions for consultation. Right from 1934, we had the Hunt Commission. In 1945, we had the Tudor Davis Commission. In 1955, we had the Gorsuch Commission. In 1960, Mbanefo. 1965, Morgan Commission. 1964, 1965. 1971 Adebo Commission, and then up to 1972 when we had the famous Dodge Award, Morgan Commission, 1964, 1965, and then 1971 Adebo Commission, and then up to 1981. Under President Shagari, there was also 1972 when we had the famous Dodge Award. They gave us two Morgan Commission, the Minimum Wage Act, 1971 and then up to that was 1981 under President Shagari, and then we ended up with a minimum wage amount of 125 naira, if you remember. And then I'll wrap up in a second. Historical context. So and then we got up to 1999 when President Shoneko set up a 19-man presidential committee, and then they gave us 5,500. From there we got up to I think 211. 2011 when we ended up with a review to 18,000, and then finally in 2019 they corrected 30,000. And the process is on again to review that. So I think consultation has always been there in our history, and it's an important process for fixing wages.
I don't want to speak for Dapo, but I'm guessing when he says the jamboree, he means the fact that everybody just saying any minimum wage that they want is coming to their head. Demanding for $1 million minimum wage, for instance, he's assuming it's too much and maybe not realistic, as you have said.
Yes, and it's important that all stakeholders work towards arriving at a realistic figure. There is no doubt that the pains are felt for the Nigerian worker, but businesses also are feeling a lot of pains as well. It's a balance in between. No one is blaming anybody, but there needs to be some realistic expectations.
Okay, so let me read this message out. How best can government overcome the likely challenge of NNM wage?
National
minimum wage, especially in the private sector, particularly in the informal sector. I think you've mentioned a little about that. That's Tina from Alimosho that sent that message.
Yeah. I think the is a two-pronged approach. One, enforcement, monitoring. The government has got to have a robust capacity for monitoring and for compliance. And unfortunately, this requires funding. And we know the situation with funding and all that. But that is one part of how to address this. The other part is to encourage formalization in the informal sector. It's not just about minimum wage, but when you get into other fiscal issues such as payment of taxes, documentation, all that, we have a problem. But you don't want to blame the informal sector also directly, because they are struggling. It's a fight for survival every single day. And when we help them by improving the general enabling conditions for businesses and for small businesses at their level to thrive and grow, what happens? They will naturally see the need to formalize. Otherwise, they won't get some of the benefits of their growth. So I think maybe that's even the more sustainable approach. How do we make the environment conducive for them to thrive and grow? Naturally, they will not escape formalizing, and then other benefits of formalizing, such as payment of taxes, compliance with national minimum wage, all that will happen, I believe, more naturally.
Okay, so I was going to ask you about the economic climes right now and the call for international investors in Nigeria, looking at the economic climate and then adding this stress, this minimum wage talk on it. Do you think it's a good enough climate for investors to come in? Is it encouraging for investors to come in at this time?
My guess is that the investors would probably, different categories of investors, but we are now using a broad brush to group all investors. There is the FDI, foreign direct investment, there is FPI, portfolio investments, meaning in the financial markets and so on. But let's just assume that we're putting all of them in one basket and saying the investors probably would, some of them may even want to see clear controls and prescriptions on how you promote decent work, how you go for social justice. There are very good, clean investors like that. They want to look consider that before they put in their money in any investment. That's on one part. And then there is also the other part that some of the investors, this may not be their main cost base. They are more worried about issues around, if I bring my money in and I want to take it out, how much stability do I have so that I'm not losing value? So that speaks to foreign exchange issues and so on. I think that might be their bigger worry at the moment.
Okay, so I have 3 text messages I have to read out to you now. I'll start with the first one. Do you think the independence of states through restructuring can achieve a living wage for workers instead of the current unrealistic national minimum wage? Aremu Fomekwe.
That's a difficult question for me. the difficulty of the question is not that it's not really that it's difficult to answer, so to speak. But I'm worried a little bit that I don't want to delve into anything politics, in this session, because the issue of restructuring and all that, maybe it's better discussed in a different forum. Probably. The main issue with the national minimum wage itself is to come up with a figure, and that we cannot overemphasize that, is to come up with a figure that is realistic. And I think that's what this question is speaking to again, making it realistic. And it is very right to come from that angle. Once you make it realistic, it's easier to comply with. And then without even enforcement and monitoring, you make it more attractive for the players to enforce. Yeah.
Okay. How does the implementation of a minimum wage in Nigeria affect productivity and competitiveness within key production sectors, given the current economic conditions in the country, mostly in oil and gas and agricultural sector?
Could you take the question again? I missed that part.
Okay. How does the implementation of a new minimum wage in Nigeria affect productivity and competitiveness within key production sectors, given the current economic conditions in the country? I don't know if I should pick this call first before you. We have... Hello.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Festus from Nigeria.
Festus, thank you for calling. Go ahead.
Yes, your last question, whether it's your last question now, that's about the effect of this minimum wage discussion on the investors.
Yes.
Well, my thinking is that it will affect the interest of investors willing to come in to Nigeria to invest their money. They want to think about how it's going to affect their profit, take-home profit. So they will think twice. That is the bitter truth about it. They will think twice. This is not a good time to start this wage issue. It's not a good time.
Okay, all right.
So the labor unions will always consult the experts before they come up with agitations on the wages.
All right, thank you
then
so much.
Secondly,
okay.
I want to request media houses to talk about pensioners. You see, when you talk of minimum wage, it does not affect pensioners very much. I can even say it does not affect them. They don't benefit from it. The pension scheme with the pension fund administrators handling retirees payment.
Okay.
They are there. They are not in pension allowances.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Those that are retired 20 years, they are not increased. And those that are retired before the scheme came up, they are having problems. So media houses should come up with discussions on the pensioners.
All right.
Pensioners that will affect somebody like myself.
Okay, thank you so much,
So
Festus. I really have to let you
spending
go.
too much time on those that are still working.
Okay, I really have to go. Sorry about that. I really have to go because we have so many other questions to answer, and the time is far spent. So the last question, that was the text message I read out.
Yeah.
Do you want to respond to that now?
Yes, I can quickly. And I'm happy that the other charge for pensioners is for media houses.
Yeah,
so.
is that for you?
Okay, so with regard to impact on the key productive sectors in the economy, like oil and gas that he mentioned and so on, I think what is good to consider here, or let me even quickly talk about other considerations, yes, for fixing minimum wages. You can fix it by sectoral activity, and this you can find in countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Mozambique.
So depending on it differs depending on the sector.
On the sector, yes. Okay. You can also fix by occupation, and this you can find in a place like Cyprus. You can do by geopolitical zones. You can all sorts. But a country will decide based on its own needs. The important thing is that if you adopt a simple process, then it's easier to implement. But if you go for these complexities, also, if I may use that expression, then you need to have the capacity to juggle all of that and to carry out implementation. So this is the main challenge that needs to be addressed. I think that a simple system works in terms of implementation.
Okay, this is the last question, and just quickly, good morning, Region 1. Please ask your guest why minimum wage is across board. I think you just answered. It's across board without factoring cost of living differing from state to state. It is not fair for someone living in Lagos and another living in Jigawa to earn the same amount. Kunle from Yaba.
Yeah. It's an interesting point, and it's a topical one whenever you're discussing minimum wages. But like Wumi said, I just touched on it quickly. If there were time, I would have said a few more in terms of equal pay for equal work of equal value, which is a concept that is applied in human resource. And simply what you try to do is that if I have a carpenter in the organization and I have a fitter and maybe I have a nurse, the organization, they are in one organization, so you want to have a fair salary scale cutting across. So if the value of their jobs, regardless of the occupation, is the same, you need to have about the same salary. But once we begin to apply minimum wages for the different sectors, you find out that the nurse will be subjected to a different minimum wage while in the same company from that the carpenter is subjected to. So over time, you lose track of how your salaries have changed. So you end up being blamed for, you could end up, not that you will, you could end up being blamed for discrimination, because at the end, certain occupations are earning less than others, while the value to the organization is the same thing. These are some of the complexities of having different minimum wages. And the simpler the system is, the better sometimes, if you don't have the institutional capacity to juggle these differences.
Okay, so we are ending the show at this point in time. It's been a really robust discussion and an interesting one. Thank you so much for everyone who contributed to the success of this. We saw your messages, your calls. Thank you so much. And thank you to our guest who took time to explain a lot of things to us, Mr. Chuma Nwankwo. He is the Africa HR Lead, Mediterranean Shipping Company, and Governing Council member of NECA. Thank you once again for coming.
You're welcome.
Now, NECA will be back here same time next week, so join us. If you have for sponsorship of NECA Voice of Business, please call Adenike on 0802 344 9145, or you can call Oluwasho on 0816 060 0305. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Olawumi Akon. We'll be back next week.
The ease of doing business has been a challenge.